talk to us a little bit about performance. I was personally just taking up sprinting again on the track, and I think I did something weird to my toe. And my toe, it's like whenever you're injured, there's more energy that needs to be directed to whatever the injury site is so that you can heal and adapt. I would love your thoughts, clinical, if there's any evidence in the literature or otherwise, on the effects that methylene blue might have on performance. What those might be. So whether that's endurance activities or maybe even strength training, which is I'm a big advocate for in terms of recovery as well. And then if you're someone who's dealing with an injury, whether it's an acute injury like my toe right now, or it's a chronic injury, maybe it's like a low back, something you have, knees are not what they used to be, shoulders is going awry. What are some ways that we can think about using this compound as a way to augment performance, but also to potentially speed up injury?
Yeah. So from a performance perspective, as I was alluding to earlier, there's evidence that methylene blue increases what's called aerobic capacity. So your ability to go longer with a capacity to go longer without actually having to stop. And that's a big problem, right? Of course, if you're trying to go far and you have to stop, well, that's the end of your race, or you have to slow down at least. And so a good example of this is I work with a guy that raced what's called the Leadville race here in Colorado. It's one of the most famous ultramarathon races in the world. It's 100 miles, around 12 and 13,000 foot peaks. And so it's not for the faint of heart. And so this particular gentleman was interested in increasing his capacity and decreasing his time. And so what we did is we gave him 32 milligrams of methylene blue every 4 hours, and he decreased his time by 3 hours. So it was his capacity. Yeah. And then on a different example, so that's just because he was able to run farther, faster without having to slow down. Right. And so the other aspect of this is, let me give you a corollary example. This is a more common one, is that I have a patient that she goes on her Stairmaster bike, treadmill, some combination of those things every morning. And she refuses to not use her methylene blue. And I asked her why. And she's like, well, I can maintain my heart rate up for 20% longer while I have methylene blue on board, as opposed to if I don't. So she has to stop if she doesn't have it on 20% in shorter, right? So she has 20% more capacity as a result of having the methylene blue on board. So that's pretty significant. And the other aspect of this, which is interesting, is that there's been some studies in animals actually where, and this actually goes along with the aerobic capacity, is that you reach your lactate threshold later when you have methylene blue on board, meaning that you go from producing energy from what's called aerobic respiration to what's called anaerobic respiration or fermentation when you make more lactate. It takes longer to get there if you have methylene blue on board. So that's the reason why these particular people, the ultramarathoner and one of my patients that loves working out in the morning, love their use of methylene blue as a way to help perform better. And there's some indication here too, Stephanie. We're still kind of working on this with a friend of mine. His name's Thomas DeLauer, that he's big into exercise and performance. And his thought here is that very likely with methylene blue on board, you actually can recover during an anaerobic workout, just during a strength training workout, between sets faster when you have methylene blue on board, because you can recover at a higher heart rate. Basically, because you're recycling energy, you're detoxing faster, as well as if you can downregulate your nervous system in between sets. And this is kind of like that parasympathetic activation. So if you can relax and do take good breaths before sets or between sets, and this is kind of a different conversation, but the idea here is that downregulating your nervous system is how you're going to get better performance when you're actually trying to strength train, right? So if you do a big set of heavy weight, you want to be recovered enough that you can do another big set of heavy weight. And so there's indications here that using methylene blue can help you get back to being ready for that next set faster, along with doing some parasympathetic things as well, like breathing and posture changes and things like that. So that's from a performance perspective. I don't know if you have any questions about that before I go over to the injury.
Well, well, first of all, that is super exciting. And then I guess for women, we talk about this on the show almost ad nauseum at this point, but I will still, this is the hill I will die on, is women need to be lifting.
Yes.
They need to be strength training. They need to get their form right. And then we add load afterwards. The other area that I think a lot of women typically avoid, if at least my community in terms of data is sprinting, is not just, I'm not talking about the Orange Theory, 45-minute, air quote hit class. I'm talking about all out 100% effort, anaerobic. You are going anaerobic for 10 seconds or, whatever it is, 10, 12, 15 seconds maximum before you start switching to that glycolic, to another energy system.
Sure.
So I guess my other question is, do we know with sprinting, like you were mentioning, the aerobic capacity seems to be improved with, doing the Stairmaster, which, like, God bless your patient, because the Stairmaster is a special kind of torture. But if we're talking about all out sprinting, let's say on a track, on a treadmill, on a bike, whatever, on a rower, erg machine, blah, 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 are we seeing any improvements, at least clinically? Maybe there's no RCT at this point, but do we see any clinical improvements with like recovery? Like if you're doing a 6 to 8 sprint session, let's say, like in between those sprints, if you're using methylene blue prior to the session, are we seeing any changes there as well?
So we don't really know yet. This is an interesting question, right? And I think that I have two answers to this question. I think my sense of this is that it's going to be very individual. Some people will feel a significant benefit doing this, and others maybe won't. I think it will actually depend on how optimized they are ahead of time and what the capacity is for them to do this in the first place. I think if they are kind of on their early stages of working on this and starting just with the sprinting, I think that's when methylene blue is going to help a ton as they're just starting to get going. But as they're getting to that sort of performance edge, my theoretic mind is going, well, you may want to make sure that they get as much anaerobic capacity as possible. So getting as much lactate buildup as possible. So you could either argue that, well, if you're reaching your lactate threshold later, then maybe you're not actually getting the same benefit, right? If you're doing that 15-second sprint. So the idea would be that you'd have to probably do more for longer to benefit. Meaning, like, so for example, like if you did your 15-second sprint, right, but you didn't hit your lactate threshold, you'd have to do a longer sprint to hit it. But that could be very beneficial over the long term.
That's like a beneficial.
Yeah.
Yes, you're going to drive up testosterone and IGF-1 and all the things that you want. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's a nuanced discussion there. Right. And I've been actually working on some protocols using like what's called hypoxia as well. So hypoxic training alongside methylene blue as a way to help kind of flood the system with more oxygen and more capacity after doing like low oxygen training. And there's some evidence there that methylene blue can at least anecdotally increase VO2 max that way. So doing hypoxic training and then going for walks, doing more aerobic work is actually another combination that seems very interesting. So these are all very, nuanced kinds of things, but I think like high level methylene blue can help with endurance for sure and keep your heart rate higher for longer because you're going to reach that lactate threshold later. So hypothetically, as a result of that, you can do more work. You can create more muscle, increase those growth hormone, testosterone stimuli more because you can go longer without having to stop. But my only sort of caveat to all this is just, where are you starting biochemically? How well your mitochondria are doing? And so knowing that is important as you're kind of thinking about like, do you start methylene blue or do you start without it? And so this is more of a nuanced discussion, but in essence, the more optimized you are, probably the more you can benefit from using it to help, improve your training and, make your gains faster is my sense. Talk
to me about injury as well. I was saying to you, I did something weird to my toe on the track on Monday. Yeah. Tell me about how we might think about whether it's an acute injury as I've sustained, or it's a chronic injury that somebody might be dealing with. What are some of the, at least clinical impressions that you might have around its potential to augment injury recovery?
Yeah. So from an injury perspective, it's very important to make that delineation, whether it's acute or chronic, because very different things are happening on the cellular side as a result of that. I think maybe starting off with the acute injury would be good. And so when there's an acute injury, there's an acute inflammatory process. If you hurt your toe, for example, for me, about a month ago, I partially tore my calf as I was just juggling the soccer ball with my daughter. It was quite surprising, to say the least. And so, but as a result of that, there was a profound amount of inflammation. And so what we've been talking about so far is these low doses of methylene blue, 4 to like 25 milligrams or so, being great for mitochondrial support, but actually higher doses of it, around 1 milligram per kilogram, which is about 50 to 70 milligrams or so of methylene blue, is a fantastic antimicrobial. So you can use it as something for an infection, but it's also really great for acute inflammation. So these higher doses of methylene blue are great for acute inflammation and acute mitochondrial stress, acute severe mitochondrial stress. So I would include a 100-mile ultramarathon as acute severe mitochondrial stress.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I was giving that particular guy 32 milligrams every 4 hours as he was running to maintain that capacity to make energy, but also helping on the detox side as well. So we know that methylene blue actually has really kind of this cool way of actually working like what I would call like an adaptogen. Adaptogens are things we take like rhodiola, ashwagandha, things like that can kind of help the system do what it needs to do depending on what's required. And when methylene blue comes in at these higher amounts, it can work just profoundly as an anti-inflammatory and decrease that reactive oxygen stress, those oxidative stress, free radical kinds of things. And so you have these higher doses of methylene blue that are profoundly anti-inflammatory, and they downregulate all these inflammatory pathways in the body and upregulate things like your antioxidant capacity, like even increasing your glutathione production. There's a couple of good studies showing that like a high dose of methylene blue, between 50 and 100 milligrams or so, like increases your glutathione production by like 4x or something like that. And so it's high. And so from an anti-inflammatory perspective, if you have an acute injury, bringing in methylene blue at these higher amounts for 5 to 7 days can be really, really helpful. I mean, of course, it's not the only thing that you're going to do. Many other things that I've done for recovery for the calf as well, but really, really amazing as an anti-inflammatory there as well. And the thing is, like, not everybody can tolerate those high doses of methylene blue right away if you have a chronic issue, chronic injury, chronic infection, chronic issues. So the problem with a lot of the methylene blue products out there is that they're too high of a dose. So you take it, you feel like crap. Well, it could be because the methylene blue quality was crap, and that's another story entirely. But it could also be because your system just wasn't ready for such a high amount of methylene blue because it's too much stress on the system. You can't make enough antioxidants. You don't have enough energy capacity, even with methylene blue around. And so what I've seen over the years to be actually interesting here is that from when there's an acute inflammation, or acute inflammatory process, you actually can tolerate higher amounts of methylene blue than you would have if you had a chronic issue. Okay. And so from a chronic perspective, if you have a chronic injury, a long-term injury, what's happening really there is that there's mitochondrial dysfunction ongoing, right? And as a result of that, and there's all this sort of dysfunctional tissue around, and as a result, you need to really go low doses of methylene blue, typically somewhere between 4 and 25 milligrams, and that's where you're going to see the most benefit because you're going to start increasing the ability of your tissue to make more energy, increasing the capacity for you to actually detoxify as well. While you're doing other things, of course, maybe you're shining some red light on your calf or your toe, in your case, in my case. And as a result, that red light therapy or near infrared, actually it's red light, 680 nanometers. So the ones you get on your panels, for example, red light panels, or sunlight, of course, has red light as well. That synergizes with methylene blue. And you can actually combine synergistic effect. Low doses of methylene blue and low doses of red light are fantastic for energy production. And actually very high doses of methylene blue over that milligram per kilogram, along with high intensity laser, is actually fantastic anti-infective as well. So just as a corollary there. So from an acute injury perspective, to sum up, higher doses of methylene blue are often required, somewhere around 1 milligram per kilogram. If you're taking that kind of methylene blue, though, I do recommend working with a practitioner just to kind of know exactly how much you're taking and why and for how long. And then for more of a chronic injury, you may need to get to that same dosing, honestly, but you want to go slower to get there. You want to start off at 4, 8, 16 milligrams and then increase your dose. Typically, I have people increase their dose every 3 to 5 days or so until they start feeling like they're getting a significant improvement.
Fantastic.